Today's the day. Final analysis of Dungeon Siege 3. Finally, after 14 days of gameplay, after exploring every inch of the game, achieving a 100% completion of it, all of the side quests, all of the dialogue options, every single talent of the skill tree, everything. Achieving finally a 100% completion of it in every sense of the word. After 30... Yes, reviewing the game, we did... The game said 24 hours total. That's what it took me to achieve a 100% completion of the game. But reviewing my own YouTube VODs, I realized that it was actually a bit more than 24 hours. It actually took me exactly 28 hours, something much closer to 30 rather than 24. So yes, please keep that in mind in terms of the total length of the game. But well, we explored everything. We covered pretty much every single aspect of the game. We were continuously analyzing it, as we usually do, in our legendary analysis, our legendary reviews of the most underrated video games. Let's get to the final analysis of Dungeon Siege 3 once and for all. And we begin with the first category of the analysis, the gameplay category. Certainly, probably the most controversial aspect that Dungeon Siege 3 has to offer. Remember, it's inevitable, it's unavoidable to mention that Dungeon Siege 3, before we get into the core gameplay mechanics of the game, Dungeon Siege 3 was developed by Obsidian Entertainment, who wasn't the original developer of Dungeon Siege 1 and 2. I'll try to go fast over the story of this, the history of the studio behind them. Basically, Dungeon Siege 1 and Dungeon Siege 2 were developed by a company called Gas Powered Games, under the command of Chris Taylor, a legendary game developer from the US, if I'm not mistaken. And he basically developed a lot of legendary PC games with his studio, which was Gas Powered Games. Basically, another example that you have of Gas Powered Games talent is Supreme Commander, a legendary real-time strategy game, from the early 2000s, as you can see. Right, so he developed Supreme Commander, Dungeon Siege 1 and 2, pretty legendary games. They had a pretty unique gameplay system, and this is why, in this case, the story of the history of the studio is important, because they used a point-and-click core gameplay mechanics, in the same vein as Diablo, but instead of controlling only one character, you would control a whole party of characters. So yes, basically, that was how Dungeon Siege 1 and 2 worked. Point and click gameplay system, but controlling a whole party. Someone long ago described Dungeon Siege 1 and 2 as the perfect breed, the perfect mixture, the perfect combination between Diablo and Baldur's Gate. Basically, it was a marriage of both styles, as I always mention. Baldur's Gate, the father of all classic RPG games, that I always mention. And while Diablo is the father of all isometric action RPG games. Now, I always mention the difference between classic RPG games and isometric action RPG games. Basically, two completely different variations of the RPG genre, so they are basically called subgenres. The basic main difference between them is that in Diablo you have real-time combat, and in Baldur's Gate it's a real time with pause combat, which is basically concealing um, the old the old remnants of the turn-based classic combat gameplay mechanics from the even more classic RPGs from the 90s, right? So that's why I always mention this when I talk about this difference, and I'm doing this just so you have an idea of what Dungeon Siege is. Here we have a Baldur's Gate 1, as I always mention when we did the complete history of PC gaming genres. In case you want to check that out, I did a complete compilation of all of the games that you see here, divided by genre. But well, that's a story for another time. Today is the analysis of Dungeon Siege 3. So, but basically, classic RPG for those of you who are joining us right now or haven't watched my integral history of PC game genres. And here we have Diablo, isometric action RPG. Two different genres. And as you can see, I have Dungeon Siege 1 plus its expansion, Legends of Arana, here, which basically is a combination of both of them. The combat is real time, you control a party, as you will see in the images and in the footage that I will show you here. So that I have shown you here. So basically, we have Dungeon Siege 1 and Dungeon Siege 2 right here, a perfect combination of both of them. Right. With all of that said, then after Dungeon Siege 1 and 2, Dungeon Siege 2 was released in the early 2000s, and Dungeon Siege 3 was released during the 7th generation, back in 2011. In 2011. Almost a whole generation after the second and the first, for that matter. After the first two games were released. So there's basically a huge gap of years between the release of Dungeon Siege 1 and 2 and both of them with Dungeon Siege 3. There's a huge gap of years between the first and second release and the third release. Right. What happened in the meantime between the second release and the third release, let's say? Gas-powered games was no more, and the franchise was acquired by Square Enix. Yes, a Japanese developer, mostly known by releasing RPG games, but Japanese RPG games like Final Fantasy, the most famous that we all know about. And previously to that, I wanted to highlight that Square Enix were actually, it's a conglomerate. It's actually two companies in one, like Bandai Namco. So, and Square Enix previously, back in the 4th generation. Yes, I'm not. This is all unscripted. Back in the 4th gen, it's just my memory. In the 4th generation, back in the period of the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, basically they were two separate companies, Square and Enix. That happened to a lot of Japanese companies back during the 6th generation, in which they had to merge. In the case of Square Enix, was even more. Yeah, they became a conglomerate even earlier, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me right. But well, Square Enix has the rights to publish, basically has all of the rights to publish any Dungeon Siege 3, 4, or whatever, any Dungeon Siege game. However, Square Enix did not develop Dungeon Siege 3. It was developed by Obsidian Entertainment. Yes, the creators, the developers of Knights of the Old Republic 2, the second one. The creators were BioWare with the first one, with Knights of the Old Republic 1, but the second one was developed by Obsidian. Fallout New Vegas was developed by Obsidian. Obsidian Alpha Protocol, we could also mention, and many more. It's a veteran studio, and basically a lot of incredible games were developed by them. So we are talking about an experienced studio. Right. With all of that said, now we have the whole picture, the genre, the history. I tried to be fast, but even so, it took me 12 minutes. But well, actually 10 because 2 were the intro. But well, just so you have a pretty summarized context of the situation of what we're gonna analyze. So, with all of that said, let's head over into the first category. Let's get to the first category of the analysis.
Injustice. Injustice gives way to trespass. Trespass demands redress. Redress comes only through blood. If the son strikes the father, let his hand be hewn off. If the serf wounds the noble, let him suffer the lash. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. If a man should trespass, let his feet be seared with hot coals, and let him be whipped from the city.
Remember that I mentioned during the intro that DungeonSiege is basically a combination of Diablo and Baldur's Gate in terms of, strictly speaking, gameplay mechanics. Or so we thought up until the second game. It was like that in the first one and the second game. What happened in this third entry, the one that we're analyzing right now? DungeonSiege 3 basically grabbed all of the gameplay mechanics of the first one and the second one and completely turned them into something different. And when I say different, I mean absolutely, utterly, completely, integrally different. Completely different. As a lot of you know, back when this game was released back in 2011, this game was extremely criticized because of this very first point. That's why this is so important to go slowly but surely. The gameplay mechanics. If you get into Metacritic, as we did at the beginning of the streams, you'll see that there's the player base basically criticized this game for not being a direct, faithful successor of DungeonSiege 1 and 2. It was so bad, it was so terrible, the backlash, the criticism to this game was so terrible that you can even get to the wiki and you'll see that there's a paragraph explaining that basically the player base stated that they don't consider DungeonSiege 3 a DungeonSiege game. Yes, I read it. It's in the official wiki of the game. When I was trying to understand the stats of the game, many of the stats of the game, because of something that we're gonna cover once we get to the rest of the categories. Yes, the original player base doesn't consider DungeonSiege 3 a DungeonSiege game because of the gameplay mechanics. Why is this? Well, as you'll see in the footage that I am showing you in this analysis, and all of my 14 gameplays, you could see that the controls are completely different. For starters, but before we get into that, the fact that this game was so much criticized because of the controls, does that make them bad? Basically, the whole premise, because a game with shitty controls, with terrible controls, is basically a flawed game. Generally, the gameplay is the most important aspect of a game, and basically, if a game doesn't have good gameplay mechanics, if the combat isn't good, especially in an RPG, it's basically flawed. Is this the case of DungeonSiege 3? Well, while most of the player base says so, and they state that the controls are terrible, I'll have to disagree on this one. And first of all, I'll explain why. First, the most basic premise. This game is meant to be played with a joystick, not with a mouse and keyboard. Yes, it's true. That part of the criticism that this game received is 100% true. The game is meant to be played with a joystick, not with a mouse and keyboard. The main player base of the original first and second games were 100% PC players, because DungeonSiege 1 and 2 were exclusively released on PC up until this day, and they'll probably never get released on consoles. They were called classics of the PC gaming ecosystem. So yes, it was a huge shock that this third entry was meant to be played with a joystick. We should also take into account that this was released during the 7th generation, the PS3 and the Xbox 360, a generation in which the gaming market was much stronger in the console side, let's say. We had the Xbox Live Arcade thriving, we had the Wii, the PS3. We were coming from the 6th generation, which was the one that received statistically the most games ever of any console generation. If you look at the gaming libraries of the Nintendo Wii, of the Xbox 360 and the PS3, these are facts. This is objective, statistically correct. They had more published games than in the modern generation. I'm talking about the PS5, the PS4, and the Xbox One Series X or Xbox One X. They had it was an extremely strong market, at least much stronger than the current situation in which PCs are much more dominant. The point is that it was a strong generation in which a lot of games and a lot of franchises were successful on the Xbox 360 and the PS3, becoming console games. The same happened to Sacred 3, for example. Sacred 2 was eminently a PC game, and then Sacred 3, they tried to turn it into a console release. It was absolute dog shit, so yeah, that didn't work well. And the same could be said for DungeonSiege 3, though there's a huge... I think DungeonSiege 3 does retain a lot of quality. Different, but it does retain a lot of quality. But well, just know that it was a period of time in which a lot of PC games were turned into console games. Right. With all of that in mind, and always keeping in mind that the game is played with a joystick, I must say that the objective, the metaphysical, objectively metaphysical statement of saying that the controls are bad, objectively speaking, metaphysically speaking, is wrong. The controls of this game aren't bad at all. Like, no, that's not the case. The controls aren't bad, objectively speaking. Why? Because when you perform an action, that action in the game, when you attack an enemy, is correctly performed. The attack does land. I know that this may sound stupid and basic, but in the case of this game, since the controls were criticized so much by the original player base of the first two games, as we've been explaining for 20 minutes, yes, I need to highlight this. The controls aren't flawed. They are perfect if you use a joystick. If you use a joystick, the controls are perfectly determined and the attacks land and they are correctly developed. And not only because the attacks land. What was the problem? The problem was, and the problem of this game is, I said was because all of the criticism that this game got was at launch back in 2011. The criticism was caused by a fallacy. The player base said the controls of DungeonSiege 3 are bad. Why? Because you have to use a joystick, whatever. If you look at all of the Metacritic reviews and all of the Steam reviews, they never say why they are bad. Because the attacks don't land, 99% of the reviews don't say that. Because you cannot perform your abilities. No. because you cannot move your character correctly through the environment. There's pathfinding issues. No, 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 and no. The attacks do land. You can use your abilities. You can direct them properly. There's no pathfinding issues in terms of the terrain and your character. No, no. I'll tell you the real reason and probably the most important and essential part of Dungeon Siege 3's core gameplay system. The player base of the first two original games complained due to the fact that they couldn't naturally translate, they couldn't inherit. This is something that I've explained in my streams. They couldn't inherit. When you play Dungeon Siege 3, you cannot inherit all of your experience from playing previous isometric action RPG games. I'll repeat it. You cannot inherit all of your experience, all of your previous experience from playing previous isometric action RPG games in terms of the controls. What do I mean by this? This is the core matter of all of this game, of all of this release, of all of this third entry of the franchise. Most of us who played the Dungeon Siege 3 previously to playing Dungeon Siege 3, let's take out of the equation, let's remove the original player base. I played Dungeon Siege 1 originally, back in the day, twice. Let's remove the original player base of Dungeon Siege 1 and 2. Let's just imagine someone who played Diablo 2, Titan Quest, I don't know, Torchlight. You get the point. Any classic isometric action RPG game, right? Imagine you play Diablo 2, Torchlight, Titan Quest. 3 classic isometric action RPG games. And then you try to play Dungeon Siege 3. You haven't played Dungeon Siege 1 or 2. All of the mechanics, all of the combat gameplay mechanics of those 3 classic isometric action RPG games won't help you in terms of understanding the controls and the combat system of Dungeon Siege 3. Besides the basic video game elements that we all know, that if you stumble upon a green bar in the bottom left corner of your screen, you will probably deduce that it's your health bar. Besides those basic elements that are present in all video games by convention, playing other isometric action RPGs like the ones I mentioned won't help you in terms of deeply understanding the core gameplay mechanics of Dungeon Siege 3. There's a clear and strong division between the rest of the isometric action RPG games and Dungeon Siege 3. I like to call this a steep learning curve. Not steep, but steeper than most isometric action RPG games, because you cannot inherit the basic elements that you would normally get from playing other isometric action RPG games. Kind of like if you play Diablo 2, a pretty clear example. If you play Diablo 2, you will probably know what to do when you play Titan Quest or when you try to play Torchlight 1 or Torchlight 2. You'll have a pretty defined idea of what you need to do. Even the stats are the same. The naming convention of the stats is the same. The controls are the same. They are both point-and-click isometric action RPG games. If we had to mention a game that allows you to inherit some gameplay mechanics that are actually used in Dungeon Siege 3, we would need to go back and mention the variation that I also mentioned in the integral history of PC game genres, the variation of the non-point-and-click isometric action RPG subgenre, a variation of the subgenre of the isometric action RPG subgenre of the RPG genre. The variation is the non-point and click isometric action RPG variation, which is represented by the original non-point and click isometric action RPG from the 6th generation, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance is clearly represented in that game. If you want a game that will actually allow you to inherit the style of the controls used in DungeonSiege 3, it would be that one. So, that's what most gamers didn't understand. That's what most of the player base couldn't understand back when they played DungeonSiege 3. That the game actually inherits a lot of elements from from isometric action RPG games, point and click, like Diablo 2, Titan Quest, or Torchlight. In terms of the stats, well, the stats have different naming conventions, but they are mostly the same. In terms of the side quests and everything, the structure, for example, the structure of Diablo is inherited by DungeonSiege 3, but in terms of the controls, they are inherited from a different variation of this subgenre of the isometric action RPG genre. The non-point and click variation represented by Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. So controls, basically controls inherited from Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. The rest, basically, there's an original naming convention that we'll get to once we get to the innovation category of the analysis. The naming convention of the stats, it's unique, but basically how those stats work, the core system of those stats, yes, it's inherited from classic isometric action RPG games like Titan Quest, Torchlight, or Diablo 2. So basically this game, it's a combination of, it's a pretty unique situation because it combines elements from different variations of the isometric action RPG genre. Which variations? Non-point and click, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, it inherits the controls, and stat system, basically how it works, not the naming convention, because that's unique and we'll get to that in a moment. From point and click isometric action RPGs, the ones that we all know. Right. That combination, what does it create? What does that combination create? A pretty unique gameplay system, which, as I mentioned before, the core matter of this game is that basically your experience from playing your previous experience that you get from playing previous isometric action RPG games won't help you in understanding this game. It won't help you in understanding this game. That's why most perceived this, most of the player base originally thought that the controls were flawed. No, the controls aren't objectively, they aren't flawed. Metaphysically, objectively, the controls aren't flawed. They have a steeper learning curve than most isometric action RPG games because you cannot inherit your experience from playing them, but instead the game is a combination of different variations. The control system is inherited from Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, and the stat system is inherited from other games, from classic point-and-click isometric action RPG games. So it's a combination of different games. So it's much more difficult to inherit, to put to use, to use your previous experience from playing other games. Generally, this is a natural process nowadays. And nowadays we are used to simply, yes, I know, this game is telling me this. Think about playing, I don't know, Destiny after playing Borderlands 1. I think that's a clear example. all of your experience from Borderlands 1 will certainly help you in playing Destiny. It will be a natural process. This is something that game developers do all the time, even more nowadays. Basically, they say, well, the player base will unconsciously inherit in their minds. All of the players will naturally use the tactics and the gameplay mechanics. They will understand the gameplay mechanics of this new game that I'm developing because they've already played the previous experience, which is extremely similar, belongs to the same genre, and the genre has certain foundations that we all know. For example, we all know that if you press R on your keyboard in an FPS game, what's gonna happen? You're gonna reload your weapon. You know how to point and shoot in. If you know how to point and shoot a gun in Call of Duty, you know how to do it, as I've said, in Halo or Borderlands or Destiny or whatever. Yes, there will be variations. For example, the RPG aspect of Destiny and Borderlands won't be present in Call of Duty or Halo, but you will mostly understand what to do, and then you just need to understand the details. That process, which probably sounds stupid to you if you are watching my review right now as a YouTube pod, that process, generally you think it's stupid because we take it for granted, and it's difficult to notice. It's something extremely subtle that reviewers back in 2011 didn't realize, that the player base of DungeonSiege 3 didn't realize, and that, combined with the fact that the original player base was angry since they were expecting something like DungeonSiege 1 or 2, well, that combination was absolutely lethal, if you ask me. Alright, so with all of that said, and this was needed because the game is a pretty unique case. Once we get all of that out of the way, and once we understand that the game doesn't have a flawed combat system, but with a rather steeper learning curve, once we understand that, let's get to the core gameplay mechanics of the game. Objectively speaking, the game features many aspects in terms of the combat and the gameplay mechanics. Anyways, I'll show you footage and you'll see what I mean. We have basic attacks, which can be performed with a one-handed weapon or with a two-handed weapon, and they are completely different according to which one you use. If you use a basic attack with a one-handed weapon, it will be short, it won't have a lot of range, and it will deal mostly individual target damage, single target damage. Sorry. And then you have the two-handed stance. We are talking about the basic attack, the very first category that I mentioned. A two-handed attack, which is generally ranged, deals area of effect damage, and basically, yes, it's used for groups of enemies. What happens? You can play the whole game without even... I completed the whole game 100% without performing a single basic attack in my one-handed stance. I always use the two-handed stance, and I know that it's the same for the rest of the classes. As you could see, I played with the mage here in this walkthrough, but it's the same with the rest of the classes because 10 years ago, when the game originally released, I played with the warrior. So, and it was the same. You basically used you could basically use the two-handed stance and finish the game like that. Right. You have those two attacks. Those two variations of the basic attack, let's say. So, we have three attacks that you can perform. Basic attack. That basic attack can be divided into two-handed stance and then one-handed stance. Then the abilities. The same for abilities and the same for ultimate abilities. In the case of abilities and ultimate abilities, there's a third variation, which are which is the defensive stance, which is basically blocking. Get to your abilities. Your abilities can be offensive, defensive, and in the case of offensive, you have two because of the one-handed stance or the two-handed stance. You mostly will only use the two-handed stance. So basically, you have two because you won't use the one-handed stance. But if you can try a single stance. And then you have the ultimate abilities, which basically is the same story. It's the same story. That's the basic division of the game. I know it sounds like a mess, but trust me, that's why I'm showing you footage. You understand it pretty quickly. It does have a steeper learning curve, but I think that relatively speaking, you can understand it very quickly. So yes, basically there's a total of 9 abilities per character. You have 4 characters. In a lot of cases, there's a lot of recycled abilities like healing or restoring focus, which is basically this game's way of calling mana. So yes, basically 9 abilities, 3 per level, kind of like once you level up a lot, not per level, that you level up, but every 5 or 7 levels you'll unlock the next row, and by the end of the game you'll have all of them. There's 9. Basically, as I've said, one-handed stance attack, basic attack, two-handed stance, basic attack, and then you have 3 levels of 3 abilities each, as you can see. And yes, basically plus the defensive ability per each of those 3 categories. So yes, 3 defensive abilities, 3 two-handed stance abilities, basic, expert, and master, let's say, and 3 one-handed stance abilities. The same, basic, expert, and master. They're pretty much the same. All right, each one of them, let's say, is unique, but for the character, but then each of the characters, I think they recycle some of them, especially the basic ones, as I've said. And then besides that, then you can also master them. You can master them by simply using them. And yes, basically, once you master them, you'll unlock the ultimate version of each one of those 9 abilities. Besides that, besides mastering them by simply using them, you'll have a second part of the skill tree, let's say, which involves choosing variations, pretty similar to Diablo 3 in this sense. But here there's basically 2 variations of each one of those abilities, which add kind of like they add added effects which don't have to do with the mastery that I mentioned previously. And basically you can only apply 5 stacks of those added modded effects to those 9 original abilities, right? I know it sounds pretty weird, but thanks to the footage here, you will understand what I mean. You can choose either one or the other of those, let's say, added effects to the basic 9 abilities that you get, to the 3 main abilities that you get throughout the game, for the two-handed stance, for the one-handed stance, and for the defensive stance. And yes, basically those will greatly modify the base abilities besides mastering them. So those added effects, this is something important and part of the core gameplay mechanics. Those added effects will affect both the ultimate version of the ability as well as the base version of it. The ultimate version, as I said, has nothing to do with these added bonuses, but rather than because these added bonuses you get them by spending your points, your skill points, the ones that we know from kind of like any other isometric action RPG game that you level up, you get a skill point, you invest it on those. The game has basically a level cap of 35, so you will have 35 points to spend precisely, which will allow you to cover most of the abilities. So yes, you can only spend 5 points of those 35, so you'll basically have 7 abilities that will be by the end of the game. If you hit the level cap, they will all be at the max. We'll have all of the 5 skill points of added effects. So yes, basically you can combine them. You can add as I've said, you can choose between 2 added effects per ability for each one of those 9 abilities, and basically you can combine them or go purely for one effect that you like or the other, right? So you can do 5 stacks of one effect or 5 of the other, or combine them. Pretty much like ice cream. In that sense, is pretty easy. You can either combine it or just have a chocolate ice cream, purely chocolate ice cream. It's the same here. But well, and the other ones, as I mentioned, you can master those abilities, and yes, it combines. By the end of the game, you can perform ultimate abilities, which also have the 5 stacks of the added effect, right? So hopefully you understood the mess that is the core gameplay system of character development in DungeonSiege 3, and you think we're done? No, we are not done, because besides that, yes, DungeonSiege 3 has a third skill tree that combines with all of the previous that we've been mentioning. The only difference is that this third skill tree is a much more traditional skill tree that you can see here, and basically it generally doesn't relate to the abilities themselves. This is much more similar to, this one affects, rather than the abilities, it affects the character itself. It's difficult to explain, but these abilities basically increase your critical chance. They basically, for example, in the case of the mage, I remember that when I was playing, a huge and important ability that changed the gameplay mechanics that I've been mentioning, and that's something we'll get into soon enough, was Eureka Moment, which basically, if I remember, no, it wasn't Eureka Moment, because that one increased the critical chance. There was another ability that I am showing here in the skill tree that basically, whenever you increased your agility, your character's agility, when you increase your character's agility, it would also increase by 50% your will. Now, we'll talk about stat naming conventions, because in this game they are a mess, but basically, agility increases critical chance, right? Generally, only critical chance. However, by getting this talent of this third skill tree, it would also give you 50% will, which actually increases ability damage. And if you combine that talent with another talent that I combined it, you could also recover focus. So yes, this is kind of like a self-contained skill tree, if I had to define it with the highest degree of precision. It's a self-contained, stat-based skill tree. It affects how stats work rather than your abilities. In this sense, we could say that DungeonSiege 3 has 2 separate skill trees. One skill tree that affects your stats, which is the self-contained skill tree that I'm showing you right now, and then we have the previous 2 that I've been mentioning that affect basically how abilities work. The first one by unlocking the abilities and achieving their masteries, which allow you to perform the ultimate versions of those abilities, and then the other one, which basically allows you to add those added effects to modify both the base abilities and the ultimate abilities that you could perform. Now, there's one last thing that we need to mention once we finish with the third self-contained skill tree that I've been mentioning, that is more related to the stats. The first one, there's a difference between the normal abilities. There's a difference between the normal abilities and the mastered abilities. And this leads me to the second core topic of the gameplay, which is the resource economy of those abilities. The resource economy. Ultimate abilities, the ultimate and the resource economy of the game in that sense for performing your abilities. Normal abilities consume something called focus, which is the classic teal mana magic bar, power bar, like we knew it, for example, in Hellgate London. There have been examples of changing the naming convention of the mana bar throughout the years, but I think DungeonSiege 3 it's an extreme because it also changes many of the base stats. In fact, there's a mod that I saw over at Nexus Mods that actually changes all of the naming conventions of the game, so it's understandable. So I think you can see the extreme point at which the naming convention of this game went to. It got to a point in which initially you don't understand what these stats mean. But well, basic abilities basically consume focus, which is the teal bar that you see right below your health bar, the one that we know, the classic mana or magic bar that we know from playing pretty much all isometric action RPGs that you could possibly imagine. And then you have a second resource. This is a pretty huge game changer. Now, let's make the final connection. Basic abilities consume focus, the basic TL bar, which never gets beyond 100. It's kind of like a fixed number. That's also a pretty huge change if you compare it to Diablo, Titan Quest, Torchlight, any other isometric action RPG. You can basically increase your total mana, your total magic points. In this game, you cannot. It's a fixed amount. It's always 100. Why? Because the ultimate abilities consume a second resource, which are those purple orbs below the focus bar that I'm showcasing you right now. Those orbs that you gradually get from advancing through the story, getting through the story of the game, advancing through the story of the game. I ended up the game with 5, as you can see here, but you start the game with 1, and it slowly grows. Most of the game you'll have 2. If I remember correctly, you'll have 2 for most of the game. If you finish the DLC, you'll get a third one, and then the last 2 are acquired kind of like almost right before the end level. I think they just wanted to make sure that the player would finish the game even on hardcore difficulty, if they managed to get to that point, basically. So yes, I ended up with 5 orbs. I hit the level cap 35, but I think you don't need to hit the level cap in order to get them. You just need to get through the story. So yes, basically there's a third resource, a huge change when compared to DungeonSiege, when compared to any other isometric action RPG. Basically, this third resource, these orbs that I'm mentioning, they are used to perform ultimate abilities, or the ultimate basic attack, which you'll never, probably most of the time you'll never do it. And yes, they are used to perform those ultimate abilities, and also they are used to perform basic defense, some of the basic defensive abilities. I know it's a mess, the game is a mess, but I am doing my best to explain it to you. Basically, remember the basic defensive abilities that I mentioned, that you can heal or you can restore your focus? Well, those also use your orbs. A pretty weird hybrid system this game has, as you can see. But yes, basically, you have to manage two resources at the same time. In that sense, during the early game and the mid game, and almost right before you get to the end game, for 70% of the game, you won't actually have to care a lot. You'll basically have to deplete your focus, and then you'll have your orbs, because performing, this is the other thing, performing basic abilities, the ones that consume focus, they feel your ultimate purple orbs right down below. And at the same time, this is the chain. Basically, basic attacks feel they basically feel your focus bar, allowing you to perform offensive, either one-handed or two-handed basic abilities. And then those basic abilities, like the one that I've been using, which is Creative Distraction most of the time, or the other one, well, at the beginning of the game I used the Clockwork Trap, but then I changed to to the Geomancy Circle, to Geometry of Annihilation. Sorry, Geometry of Annihilation. Geometry of Annihilation would it feels the basic ability feels the purple orbs down below, and then you can either perform your ultimates or heal yourself or restore your focus through your basic defensive abilities. I know, MS, but there you have it, perfectly explained. Basic attacks fail the focus as a summary. Basic abilities, offensive basic abilities, either one-handed or two-handed, fail the ultimates, and the ultimates don't feel any of the any other resource, but they are basically used to perform your ultimate offensive, either one-handed or two-handed abilities, or your basic, not the ultimate, either ultimate offensive, one-handed or two-handed, or basic defensive abilities. Oof, that's a lot, which are basically healing yourself or restoring focus. Oof, now that's a lot, but there you have it, the gameplay loop perfectly explained with all of the modifications and everything. On top of that, let's get to another section that we need to get to. What's the other thing that could affect your how much damage you deal, or how much health you have in your health bar? The health bar is not fixed, but the mana bar is. As I said, the focus bar. Sorry, the focus bar is fixed at 100 all the time. That's so weird. A game in which you cannot increase your total amount of mana. So yes, that's extremely weird. Your total amount of focus, in this case, as it is called. Before I forget, if you play the DLC, you also get ultimate abilities. 3 basic defensive ultimate abilities, which are basically healing yourself, performing an attack, or having or being invulnerable to damage for some seconds. So yes, if you play the DLC, on top of that, you have to add 3 ultimate abilities that basically consume your purple orbs down there, your third, your basically second resource. I know it's a mess, but that's basically how the economy of the combat gameplay of this game works. That's basically the economic system of the combat gameplay mechanics of the game. I know it's a mess, but once you get it, the gameplay flows. So yes, that's the basic idea. Now, that's not all there's to it, because we haven't talked about the stat system. The next thing that we need to get to once we've inside of the gameplay category of the analysis, we need to get into the stat system of the game. The stat system of the game, it's a mess. Why is it a mess? because the stats are wrong, because there's something wrong with the game. No, because of the naming convention that I've been constantly mentioning. Here I'm leaving you footage of how of the original meaning of the naming conventions of the game, taken from the official Wikia page that you can see here if you're watching this as a YouTube pod. Here you can see that for some reason, for some impossible to unexplainable reason, for something impossible to logically decipher, they changed 80%, 70% of the naming conventions of all of the game's stats. Yes. This is something pretty weird to get into, but basically, throughout the game, you collect something called essences dropped by enemies. You cannot buy them. While you can buy standard or below standard gear from shops, the game does feature shops in terms of the item system of the game. The game basically, as you can see here, you have your basics equip slots that you get in most RPG games, not even isometric action RPG games. Basically, you will have two weapons, each one of them for each of the two stances that I have been previously mentioning, and they will basically affect your stats separately. They'll affect your stats completely separately. The one-handed stance weapon will affect your basic attack damage and your ability damage separately. In the case of the mage, the capacitor, the belt, is used in combination with the one-handed stance weapon, and then the two-handed stance weapon, in this case the orb of the mage, used by the mage that you could see in all of my footage, they individually determine the basic attack stat of your character and the ability stat of the base ability attack stat of your character. Yes, separately. You can even see that in the menu, in the inventory, in the equipment menu of the game. You can see that the stats change according to which stance and weapon you choose. Basically, the stance changes automatically when you hover. Well, you actually don't have a mouse, so you don't hover. But whenever you don't even select, but you are simply moving through the menu, and you move through the one-handed stance or the two-handed stance. So yes, basically those affect your basic attack damage and your ability damage, your base ability damage individually, separately. Okay, going back to the essences. Gear in this game, the rest of the equipment slots, kind of like the boots, the chest, the amulets, the rings, they all, the rest of the equipment affects both stances. So yeah, pretty much they affect both stances, the base attack and the rest of the stats. Now, getting into the stat system, you collect something called essences, as I've been mentioning. Those essences add specific stats that gear doesn't inherently have. That gear doesn't inherently have increased critical damage, for example, or in the case of this game, bloodletting, vampiric attacks. They are all basically, for example, regaining health through your basic attacks, regaining health through your ability damage, through your ability damage, and the other one through your basic attack damage. Or, for example, warding, which deals a fixed amount of damage. I don't know. The stat system, it's a mess. I highly recommend that if you decide to play the game, first check out the official Wikia, in which they have all of the stats kind of like translated. Basically, the stats of this game needed to be translated because, as I've said, the naming convention was so weird that you at the beginning you won't understand. It took me up until late mid game to understand how to have a comprehensive understanding of the stat system in this game. So you can fix that by either looking up what the stats mean over at the wiki, or you can install a mod that I just found out about in the over at Nexus. Over at the modding website, over at Nexus Mods. Over at Nexus Mods, there's a mod that basically translates all of the weird naming conventions that all of the essences in the game have. Those essences basically add those special effects, as I've said. And basically, what I did in my case strategy was to increase my agility. Then one of the perks of the skill tree, of the third skill tree, the one related to stats that I mentioned, would increase my agility, as I've said, and at the same time, it would increase my base ability damage by 50% because it would increase will by 50%. And yes, I ended up with a 32, almost 32 critical chance with an extremely increased critical damage, which is basically called Doom in this game. Yes, they called Doom. Doom equals critical damage. So I had a pretty high critical damage thanks to a relic that I got in the DLC, and basically that's why my attacks would hit so hard in the end game that you've been watching the streams. So yes, basically the game does feature a pretty complex naming convention for the stats. But once you understand all of that, that's why I've been mentioning this, that prior experience with Diablo 2, with Titan Quest or Torchlight, it's not useful in terms of understanding how DungeonSiege 3 works. Right. I tried to summarize the complex stat system, economic system, and ability system and skill tree system, all four of them at the same time in this hour of review. But well, basically there you have a pretty good explanation of the gameplay mechanics of the game. Then of course your gear can add some. It can increase your health, it can increase everything except for your focus. As I've said, the focus is a fixed amount that you cannot modify, and yeah, that's how the game works. Your character will be pretty OP. As for the rest, as I've already mentioned, the extra 3 DLC abilities that you can get. The fact that they locked 3 extra DLC abilities behind the paywall is disgusting, but as I've said, Obsidian probably wasn't guilty of this, but rather Square Enix. They have a pretty long history with microtransactions and those things. So yeah, pretty much. The level cap is 35. So yes, you'll have the same amount of skill points in the second and the third skill trees. I know, pretty confusing. You can only respec if you have the DLC, the Treasures of the Sun DLC. So yes, another thing that we need to get into in terms of the gameplay mechanics of the game. The combat gameplay mechanics of this is something that we'll get into once we get to the level design. But basically, since the game has a lot of enemy recycling, the combat gameplay mechanics of a lot of bosses in the game will be repeated. For example, you'll go up against a lot of Archons. And yes, basically, in that sense, you have four, as I've said, you have four classes, four characters to choose from. Katarina, Anjali, Lucas, and Reinhardt. You have the mage, the warrior, the gunner, let's say, with Katarina, and the Archon. Basically, I played the game originally with Lucas, with the warrior. It was much more difficult because you only have melee. And then, of course, now I played it with the mage. I haven't played it with the Archon or Katarina or the gunner. So yes, basically there's a lot of recycling because the gameplay mechanics. There's a lot of gameplay mechanics recycling besides enemy recycling because basically Anjali's abilities. One of the characters that you can select, the abilities are used by a lot of enemies in the game. The same goes for Lucas, for example. Let's say that one is a bit more concealed because the animations are different, but they're basically the same. And even with the dapper old gent, with one of the later bosses of the game, you have to. It's basically a mage, and I played as Reinhardt, and they were basically the same. And there was also a mini mage boss during early game when you arrive at Stonebridge. So yeah, basically no, there's a lot of recycling in terms of enemy mechanics. That's one side note that I needed to add. All right. With all of that said, with all of that incredibly long and in-depth explanation of the gameplay mechanics of DungeonSiege 3, we can get to the rest of the categories, which aren't as incredibly controversial or paramount in the case of this game's analysis, because they are pretty straightforward, except for the last one, the innovation and the level design, perhaps to some degree. But well, basically, I think I've covered everything in terms of the gameplay mechanics that it has to offer. There's one last thing before I get to the next section of the analysis. The one thing that in which the criticism to this game is definitely justified is the fact that the camera doesn't behave like your normal isometric action RPG game. No, the camera certainly has issues in the sense that sometimes it's way too zoomed in. The system that the game uses is simply zooming out the camera when you are going up against the boss, which generally involves a wider area in which you are gonna fight with that boss. Basically, you need the camera to zoom out, and that's performed automatically only for boss fights. They probably had to manually zoom out the camera for each of the boss fights, which isn't the best solution, but at least they did something, let's say. So yeah, as for the rest of the game, there are some angles. For example, when you're rotating the camera inside of a cave, you will realize that sometimes it will get extremely zoomed in and you cannot see anything, and maybe you're surrounded by enemies, and maybe that's a problem. Another negative aspect is that it's true, and that point of the criticism, that one is objectively true. Yes, the camera could have been a bit more zoomed out, and that would have made it much better. Also, the health bar of the bosses sometimes gets in the way because of how zoomed in the camera is. You can basically press R3 and zoom in the camera even more, which I highly recommend you don't do it because it's absolutely crazy, because the camera already has flaws in terms of being extremely zoomed in. So if you add that on top of the base flawed camera, it will be even worse. Right, another thing, it's true that at the beginning, in the early phases of the game, when I started playing it, sometimes when you dodge and you immediately perform a basic attack, sometimes you can have a problem landing that basic attack until you get used to directing your attacks with the sticks of the joystick. It's true that in early game you could miss some attacks, but then during mid-game and end-game, during the mid-game and the end-game parts of my analysis, I didn't miss a single basic attack after dodging. So it would be unfair. I've been rewatching my bots, and it would be unfair to say that it's flawed, that the controls are flawed because of that. I need to say that they have a steeper learning curve because, as I've said, I couldn't land some basic attacks after dodging during early game, but it actually didn't happen to me during mid game. Realistically speaking, it didn't happen to me during mid game and end game and the end game. Only the early game part of the game. Once I got used to it, it became second nature. So we need to call it, objectively speaking, a steeper learning curve rather than flawed. I'm trying to be as fair as I can with the game. One last thing which is flawed, is the fact that the targeting system for some of your abilities, namely my Geometry of Annihilation, that one is flawed because the targeting system sometimes, when you try it, this happened to me even throughout the whole game, mid game, early game, and end game, it happened to me. I couldn't fix this. In that sense, not fix it. I couldn't master it because it's actually flawed. I wanted to highlight this huge difference. My Geometry of Annihilation would inevitably miss from time to time because it would be performed kind of like on top of me. It would actually use my character as the center of the targeting area of the ability rather than the other enemies. You fix that, let's say, you master that by simply getting closer to enemies, and once this is something extremely subtle but important because it has to do with the targeting system of the base combat gameplay mechanics of the game. You need to get closer to enemies, and that way Geometry of Annihilation is casted, is kind of like on the enemies, on top of the enemies. It should always use your enemies as the center of the area of effect in which you are casting the ability, or in which you are casting the ability, basically. That's the idea. That's why there's kind of like this, you can tell also the amount of life left of the enemies by a circle at their feet, which goes from green to yellow and then to red when they are about to die. And basically that's how you notice that you are in range, let's say, and that the circle will be casted on top of that enemy rather than on top of yourself, using you as the center of it. Right, this sometimes fails because in the heat of battle, especially when you're playing as the mage, as I was, you try to always keep your distance with the enemies. You always try to keep your distance with the enemies, and that causes you to cast it a lot of the time around you, using you as the center of the area of effect ability of Geometry of Annihilation, namely of Geometry of Annihilation. And that tells me another important fact, which also has to do with the fact that in all of the cutscenes of the game, except the opening one, of course, because that one is specific to your character, the warrior is kind of like the one portrayed. Also, the warrior is kind of like the cover of the game, of the box art of the game, of the official box art of the game. In the case of the warrior, you cannot miss your attacks because they are all melee, and all of the things that I've been mentioning only happen with ranged attacks. So I can tell that the base core gameplay mechanics of the game, when it was initially being developed, were probably all developed around the warrior rather than the mage, rather than the archon or the gunner. So yes, the warrior is kind of like the star of the show, and the base character that it's pretty clear that they created the game around that character. That happens in some cases. For example, in Borderlands 1, then they fixed it with subsequent updates. But for example, in Borderlands 1, and I played as the sniper, you can tell that originally they developed it around Roland, around the main gunner with automatic rifles and those. I have that impression. At least I get that impression from the game. And there are some other cases in which you can tell that they designed the game originally around a certain class. That shouldn't happen, and I shouldn't even think about it when playing the game. I shouldn't notice it. The player shouldn't notice that. And the fact that I can notice that DungeonSiege 3 was probably developed around the warrior class, and you could arguably say around the Archon class secondarily. You could say secondarily the Archon class as well, but the main one is clearly the warrior. And I played with the warrior originally when the game came out, in fact, and yeah, it was also pretty hard because it only had melee attacks, but the abilities, I remember, they all would land without any kind of issue. The warrior doesn't have this issue that I'm mentioning with the mage, so keep that in mind. That's a flaw, that's another flaw that I wanted to highlight, but well, overall, if we don't take into account this, that the gameplay mechanics, I get the impression that they were originally designed around the warrior.
My family has a long history in this valley. Beautiful place from a safe
PC.
distance.
Alright, let's get to the second category of the analysis, people. This one is not as important, not as controversial, and not as long as the gameplay category that I had to explain it extremely in depth. In terms of the technical aspect of the game, we are talking about a game that is extremely polished, flawless in terms of the technical presentation it has. As I always mention, consider that I analyze the graphics of the game based on the time it was released in. So we are talking about the context 2011, first of all. As I mentioned, the 7th generation of gaming consoles, PS3, Xbox 360, the Wii, the Nintendo Wii. And in that context, the graphical effects of the game, let's begin with the graphical effects, they are amazing. From the hand-drawn shadows that I've been constantly mentioned, for example, in the Grand Chapter House. In the Legion Chapter House, you could see that they designed, they manually designed the shadows of a lot of the candles and a lot of the light sources of the game manually. Of course, they had no ray tracing back in the day. We should remember that there was no ray tracing back in the 7th generation, so they had to manually create them. And the way they did it, the perfect angles of the projected lights and the shadows are perfectly designed. The projected angles of the lights and the shadows in this game are perfectly designed, if we are mentioning that. Also, the bloom sources, for example, in the final level, I remember, besides adding rain, and besides all of the different terrains that the game has, the different sources of bloom are amazing. For example, the torches, the bloom of the torches in the game, both in the swamp and in the final level, they are amazing, especially in the final level. The different terrains, the terrains are amazing. They range from the desert in the DLC, the the forest in the Rook and Bowl, and the first section of the game, caves all over the place, snow, city, asphalt, let's say. So yes, and another thing that I wanted to highlight, and to highly recommend you pay attention to, when I showcase the game, I showcase the 3D audio it has. I'll showcase it here once again, just so you have an idea. But basically, each of all of those varied and diverse terrains that I'm mentioning, they all have their own unique footstep sounds. I know this sounds stupid, but back in the 7th generation, this wasn't the standard, and you pretty much had a generic footstep sound for all of the terrains. In the case of this one, it has unique 3D footstep audio for, and it has different sounds for each one of those terrains. Footstep sounds for each one of those terrains. Besides that, what I just mentioned, it has an amazing 3D audio system. You can perfectly tell when a waterfall is on your left side or your right side. Here I'm trying to exaggerate it so you can notice it. With my 3D audio. My 3D audio is basically designed to enhance this and exaggerate it. But if it doesn't have a good 3D audio system, as you can imagine, it's impossible. So the fact that I know that over at YouTube, the sound quality of the 3D audio may be a bit degraded, but I've been watching the VODs and I could tell, watching it on YouTube, that the game does have a pretty good 3D sound system. As I've said, I'm trying to exaggerate it with my own system here, but I could at least perfectly tell that when a waterfall was on my right side or my left side. So here you have a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Example of what I'm talking about. So yes, in terms of the graphical effects and the sound effects of the game, there's nothing I can complain about. The graphical effects of the attacks are amazing. There's a bit of recycling, as I've said, because of the fact that the abilities, the healing ability and the focus regenerating abilities are shared across the characters. And as for the rest, even some of the characters like the Archons have bloom sources that I've been mentioning, especially in the final boss fight against Jane Cassinder, you could also notice it. Amazing. In terms of the technical presentation of the game, it's a 10 out of 10. Nothing to complain about. Zero flaws. For a game that was released back in 2011, the game is fully voice acted, is fully voiced. So even your main character, so it's incredible. It's a technical marvel. It looks better than Diablo 3 if we have to establish a direct comparison, but the game is completely and totally amazing in terms of the technical quality it has. I should also mention the 2D backgrounds that it has. I also mentioned them when we did the review of The Lord of the Rings War in the North. But yes, basically the game features an amazing sound and graphic system. All of the graphical effects and all of the graphics and all of the sounds are amazing. 10 out of 10. Now, how does this adequate? How does this game runs on modern PCs? Because a game could have amazing graphical effects for the time it was developed in, but then there are a lot of old school PC games that are plagued with technical issues that make them horrible to play nowadays. Now, how was the case with Age of Empires, with DungeonSiege 3? With DungeonSiege 3, the game runs perfectly at unlocked frame rates. The game plays at unlocked frame rates and unlocked resolutions. With that I mean you can play it up to 4K. I played it at 2K, and you could watch the stream at 1080p. The effects scale perfectly. So yes, unlocked frame rates and resolutions. So yes, I played at 2K and 144 FPS. So you shouldn't have any issues. Zero modding alongside the DLC. Perfect. So you have unlocked frame rates and resolution, and with all of that said, I think we can award, in terms of the technical category of the analysis, it's a 10 out of 10. The game is perfect. I haven't encountered a single bug, except for some, let's say, occasional pathfinding issues that never got me stuck at all. Nothing at all in that sense. 10 out of 10. I love all of the golden tone of the colors that the game uses for the save system, for the save spots of the game. The presentation is amazing. The attention to detail is amazing, and yeah, pretty much the game looks and feels amazing in terms of the presentation that it has. Extremely polished. 10 out of 10. The technical aspect of the analysis, I think you'll thoroughly enjoy it. It's a 10 out of 10. From the rain to the snow and everything, amazing. Totally, completely amazing. Looks better than Diablo 3. So imagine.
The walls are close here. If it comes to a fight, we won't have room to move.
Right. The technical aspect, it didn't take us a lot of time. It's basically flawless. So let's get to the third category of the analysis, a relatively important part of it. So yes, basically it took me 30 hours, 30 hours to complete the game with a 100% completion of it on hardcore difficulty. We also played it, I should also mention that we played it on hardcore difficulty. Remember, I always think that to uncover the true nature of a game, you always have to play it on the hardest difficulty possible. Never play a game on medium, never play a game on easy, because you won't be able to uncover the true nature of the gameplay system it has. That's the reason why I always recommend people to play it. Even if it's the first game you're gonna play it on the hardest difficulty available possible. There was this tendency in during the 7th generation with hack and slash games and also Mass Effect to forbid the player from playing on the hardest difficulty at the beginning. I think that's disgusting and it shouldn't exist. Always hardest difficulty first play, to uncover the true nature of the core gameplay mechanics of the game. Right. With that said, let's get to the core level design of the gameplay mechanics. There's a lot of enemy recycling. There's a lot of enemy recycling that the game does. As I've said, there's an extremely poor amount of enemy variety. There's a deficiency in enemy variety, like as if we were talking about deficiency in vitamin D or C. The game has a huge deficiency in terms of enemy variety. It's kind of like standard, a bit below standard for an isometric action RPG. We would say below standard if we are comparing it to something like Titan Quest, like Diablo 2, like Torchlight. Extremely low enemy variety in comparison to other isometric action RPG games. You have basically the Lescansi soldiers, the goblins, the automatons, the cyclopses, the archons, let's say by the end of the game, the legionnaires, zombies, mummies, but no more than that. The game is way too long for only having, let's say I named 8, let's suppose I forgot about some of them. Spiders, 9. I don't know, the yetis, the fecal weirs, or however they are called. 10, let's say, being generous, 15 enemies. 15 enemies. It's way too low. The enemy variety in this game is way too low. The gameplay mechanics of those enemies are always the same. There's a lot of recycling. The game recycles a lot in that sense. I would have loved the budget to be bigger, because they probably had a lot of constraints, because that those are clear signs of constraints in terms of game development. Also, a lot of the phases, this is something subtle but important, because it's another sign of rushed development, of a rushed development cycle, is that a lot of the faces of the NPCs over at Stonebridge are the same as the ones present in the Rook and Bowl, so they also recycled a lot of NPC faces. They just changed the clothes of them so the player wouldn't notice, but I did notice because I'm unbearable. So basically, and I've reviewed a lot of games, so yes, basically, a lot of them are recycled. There's a lot of recycling. In terms of the level design, I would say that the length is much more respectable, but the fact that the length is respectable and there's so much recycling in terms of enemy variety, that causes a pretty weird relation, which involves creates a relatively dull, a relatively repetitive farming environment, right? So in this game you are not meant to farm, in fact, but let's say while you're doing the side quests, the way of farming in this game is doing side quests, and basically you go up against the same enemies and the same gameplay mechanics of those enemies, because you could recycle, for example, another class that I forgot, let's say another enemy that I forgot, the Lescansi witches are then reused in the swamp with Maruyatum. It's basically the same enemy model, the same mechanics. You could recycle the graphical aspect of the enemies, but create different mechanics, and in the case of this game, they are basically the same. They are the same gameplay mechanics, so you're not only recycling the models, the graphical aspect, you are also recycling the gameplay mechanics. Imagine going up against going up against the Lich King in World of Warcraft, and then going up against Sylvanas in World of Warcraft, and both of them having the same gameplay mechanics as their subordinates, as the low-level NPC subordinates that they have, the low-level monsters, kind of like Sylvanas. The boss is the same as a low-level Night Elf Ranger, or Arthas has the same gameplay mechanics as the low-level undead warrior subordinate. That's basically the core issue with the repetitiveness of the gameplay mechanics. Right, as for the rest, the game features several regions of the Kingdom of Ebb. You have the Rook and Bowl. Basically, from the Rook and Bowl, you go to the swamp, and then from the swamp, this is an extremely brief summary. You go through some caverns, you get to the from the Rook and Bowl, you get through some caverns, you get to the swamp. From the swamp to the Stonebridge. Stonebridge is pretty huge. It has several areas, and then basically from there you can access the Aranoi Desert, the DLC, and then Glitterdale Cave to rescue Queen Rosalyn. And then from there you head over to the final level. Basically, Stonebridge is the end section of the final level. I think they could have gone for a better cohesive environment in terms of the map layout of the game. They probably ran out of, this is something that I mentioned, they probably ran out of development time and budget by the time they reached Stonebridge, and they had to kind of like end the game there. They could have easily extended the game by adding more main quests of recruiting more allies to your cause before assaulting Jane's fortress in the end game. At the end of the game. So, and that was probably the original idea, and they had to ignore it. They had to scrap it because they didn't have the development time or the resources from Square Enix. Probably Obsidian didn't have those. And that would be a pretty good explanation on why the game technically ends in Stonebridge. Technically, Stonebridge is the final area of the game. And there's another thing, which is the fact that in the first game, Stonebridge is kind of like marks exactly the mid game of your journey through the Kingdom of Ebb. So I think they were going for the same, because Stonebridge has kind of like all of it has the lore and the cohesive role of being exactly the mid game of any DungeonSiege game, and here it's the end, so they probably ran out of development time and resources. So yes, and then they had to add the Aranoi Desert as kind of like a compensation after they released the game, and they knew that they wouldn't be developing DungeonSiege 4 never again. That was not gonna be a reality. In fact, the game has a lot of hints in terms of saying at the end of the Aranoi Desert, at the end of the Treasures of the Sun DLC expansion, which we completed with a 100% completion. It has a lot of hints, and also at the ending of DungeonSiege 3 of the main game, you also get a hint that the game that they were expecting to release DungeonSiege 4 completing this map of the Kingdom of Ebb. But well, here Stonebridge is the end. The areas are fairly straightforward. It's not an open world game. It uses the classic BioWare style of semi-open world that you would normally find in Mass Effect, Knights of the Old Republic, or Dragon Age Origins, which I definitely love in the case of Dragon Age Origins, in all of them, but Dragon Age Origins, I think it has the best map. But well, it has this semi-open world style used in BioWare games, and basically the level scales pretty smoothly. The leveling curve is smooth up until you reach level 35, and there are a lot of mini boss fights in that sense. Something unique to this game, that you have mini boss fights before you reach the final bosses of each of the side quests or the main quest. So yes, you can stumble upon those. And in terms of something that I always comment, which is the influence of the gameplay mechanics on the level design, in the final level there's something that I wanted to highlight, that they that even your companion highlights the CPU automatically highlights this your companion whenever you when you enter the final level of the game for the first time. I think in this case it was Lucas for me who highlighted it. He said, "These are narrow passages. It will be difficult to fight in here," he says. And yes, this is something that I've been constantly mentioned. This is the first time actually that I see it. And I love to see it mentioned literally in a game, which is the influence of the gameplay mechanics on the level design. Or the influence of the level design at the same time on the gameplay mechanics. When the level is, as I always mention, and I mentioned this during my analysis of Havencast Rise of the Mage, there it's a pretty unique case because the because the level design hugely influences the gameplay mechanics, in the sense that when you are fighting in narrow corridors, according to the gameplay mechanics of the game, the level design can force you to improve to make more difficult the gameplay, the combat of the game, and it can influence it and forcing you to be better, to improve, to be on your toes. In the case of Havencast Rise of the Mage, for example, I highlighted that you are casting spells and the time it takes to cast a spell basically is crucial. It's paramount. It's in that's the time when you can get killed, and the fact that Havencast Rise of the Mage has a lot of narrow corridors, you don't have a lot of room. You don't have a lot of room to cast those spells, and you get killed. The same happens for Hellgate London when I analyzed it. There's a lot of narrow corridors which cause the game to be difficult because you can be surrounded by demons in that case, and you get killed in that game because you cannot get through enemies in it. Something specific of that game. So yes, how does the influence of the level design affect the gameplay mechanics in DungeonSiege 3? Well, most of the time you'll be rolling. You can block attacks in this game, but mostly you'll be rolling, avoiding attacks. In the case of the mage, he makes a pretty slow teleport, a pretty short teleport from position A to position B in the map, which basically replaces the roll, but it's basically the same. So yes, the game does have narrow corridors. Yes, specifically in caves. In caves, you can see the influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics, and in the final level, as the companion that you have with you suggests as you enter it, we don't have a lot of room to fight in here. I loved it because it's the first time, as I've said, that it's literally highlighted by the same developers that the level design is influencing the gameplay mechanics because you are fighting in narrow corridors, and generally you don't have a lot of room to roll. Especially the final boss fight also has a lot to do with this, especially the first phase of the final boss fight with Jane. You don't have a lot of room to escape. The detection range of the enemies, they went for a much more classic approach rather than, for example, I always praise Hellgate London in this sense. Enemies have an amazing detection range, and they kind of like fix on your position and they follow you, they chase you all the way until the end of the dungeon. In the case of something like World of Warcraft, that I always cite as an example, enemies chase you up until a specific point and then they return to their original positions. This was always the classic way of handling the enemy detection. In DungeonSiege 3, it's like in World of Warcraft. They chase you up until a certain point, and then they return to their original positions. So they went for a classic approach. In the case of bosses, this is fixed by adding limits. There's kind of like this wall of fire. It can be, they use different colors, but it's basically always a wall of fire, either purple or red or whatever, or blue in the case of the Scansi witches. The game automatically raises this wall of fire, and you are kind of like fighting always in an enclosed area. That highly influences the gameplay mechanics. especially in the case of boss fights, right? So I would say that the level design completely influences the gameplay mechanics of the game, especially in boss fights. In the rest of the game, in caves, it's also influenced. For example, the Bodianoid caves and everything. Um, yes, there's an influence because the passages are narrow and you don't have a lot of room to escape. But then for the open world, let's say huge areas, there's not a lot of influence because you generally have a lot of room to escape. The thing is that if you play the game on hardcore difficulty, and I highly suggest you do so, because as I've said, it's the way of uncovering the true nature of the gameplay mechanics of the game. You will have a lot of room and there will be next to zero influence in terms of the gameplay mechanics of the game at all. So yes, basically I don't think the level design influences the gameplay mechanics in open world areas, but it does so the in boss fights and caves. So yes, they went for that solution in terms of enemy detection and the influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics. Overall, the level design follows a pretty similar structure to Diablo 2 in that sense. Just like I said that the controls are like Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, this one follows the basic structure of Diablo 2. It doesn't call the different sections acts, but they are basically acts. You can clearly see the difference in environments when you go from desert, in the case of the DLC, to forest, or to a city, in the case of Stonebridge. Basically, that's the main premise. The important thing is that if you play on hardcore difficulty, you get killed in one shot, regardless of how OP you may be. I think that's a pretty positive thing that the game that the game does, that the developers thought about it, that kind of like, it doesn't matter how OP your the character level, the character of the player is, if he decides to play on hardcore difficulty, he'll be killed in one shot, right? So in that sense, the difficulty is properly designed. The part of the difficulty which isn't properly designed in terms of a level design is the fact that, just like, and I will cite one, I'll cite one viewer of my stream, precisely one friend here of the stream, Scarlet Dragoon, precisely, he mentioned to me that the first boss of the game, Rajani, was the gatekeeper, and he was completely right. So Scarlet, if you're watching, you were right. Now that I've completed the whole game, you were completely right. In case you watched this as a ball, you were completely right. Rajani, the first boss of the game, is the gatekeeper. I think he mentioned in that stream that only 24% of the registered Steam users could get through that boss because of how unbalanced the difficulty is. But then the rest of the game, it's much easier once you know how to deal with how to develop your skill tree. Even though I would say that the bosses of the DLC are a tad noticeably harder. They are a bit noticeably harder than the basic bosses, except for Rajani, as I've said, because that one is unbalanced. So yes, unbalanced difficulty in terms of, well, but consider that I did all of the side quests. If you don't do all of the side quests, you can, and you play on hardcore, it can definitely be a challenge. If you know how to develop your character and everything, it gets moderately easy. So yes, basically, unbalanced difficulty at the beginning. The game will feel extremely difficult at the beginning, extremely hard, and then it will be piece of cake, will be easy. So yes, except for the bosses of the DLC, the final boss of the DLC and the and the previous to the last one, they are a bit more difficult. So yeah, because basically you can be killed in one shot. But as for Jane Cassandra and the final boss, I finished them all first try, so I basically get the idea that they developed the DLC after the main base game. So yeah, or at the same time at least. With all that said, once we've addressed the difficulty, the enemy variety, the environment variety of the game, and everything, we can say that the level design is decent. Not as perfect as the technical aspect of the game, but it's decent. It has all of the environments. In that sense, I cannot complain. Enemy variety could have been better. I can't complain about that. It uses a lot of recycling. Constraints, as I've said, of development time and budget, most probably. So yes, we have a lot of issues with that. And as for the rest, well, as I've said, it's fine. The level design is fine. It's not perfect, but it's fine. There's nothing out of the ordinary, except for that unbalanced difficulty at the beginning of the game.
Wait, no weapons. We've come to talk, not to fight.
Quickly, Rajani. We shouldn't be here.
Jane doesn't know you're here, does she?
We only speak for ourselves, not for Our Lady.
Jane is first among our sisters, like her mother before her. We don't want to betray her, but...
Jane has lost her way. She talks of visions and dreams. A great tree, carrion birds. She claims to hear the voices of our lost gods in her mind, and that proves she is mad.
So what do you propose?
You spared my life in Raven's Rill, and when you spoke to Jane in Glitterdelve, you weren't the monster that she said you'd be. I don't want to see my sisters destroyed in Jane's pointless war. Too few of us are left. We ask for your mercy, for our sisters and for Jane herself. In return, we'll grant you whatever aid we can.
I want to know more about you before I decide.
Quickly then, before someone sees us.
If you've lost confidence in Jane, why follow her at all? Choose a new leader.
Leadership is no matter of choice, not for us. We are bound to Jane, just as we were bound to her mother.
The first sister burns brightest of all. Her fire sustains us. Snuff her out, and we would all begin to fade.
Can you tell me who you are? Where you came from?
Your people call us Archons, but we have no such name for ourselves. We're just sisters, as we've always been. Our only history comes from myths and legends. They say that we served the creator gods before they tumbled to earth. We have no memory of that time. Our first awareness came with a sense of terrible loss, but we cannot remember what came before. Jane is deluded and confused, yes, but please, don't judge all our sisters by her example alone.
I'll try not to kill your sisters, but Jane needs to answer for what she's done.
The woman did murder our families, not to mention all the people who died in the war.
No. You'll have no help from us. Not if you...
Wait. If Jane's
At the
gone,
beginning of the game. Right. Let's get to another aspect that is certainly flawless in this game. As I mentioned, fourth category of the analysis, the Grandeur. Remember that I always mention this. If you haven't read my explanation over at the Twitch page, if you're watching this as a YouTube VOD, what's Grandeur? Grandeur is basically the combination of the impact of the ambience, lore, and world building on the player. And in that sense, just like the technical aspect of the game, this game is flawless. Flawless in what sense, Erasor? In all of them. In terms of the storytelling, in terms of storytelling, lore, world building, polishing aspects of the environment, everything. everything. The impact of the story on the player, everything. Everything. But let us begin with the evidence. One of the most clear influences that this game has in terms of the story, the soundtrack, and the dialogue lines. The dialogue choice wheel, clearly inherited from the huge influence that a specific game had on all of the rest of the games of the 7th generation. Can you guess which game I'm referring to that I always mention? If you've been watching the series, you will know what game I'm referring to. Yes, basically Mass Effect. We can see the huge influence of Mass Effect on a lot of games during the 7th generation, from Fallout to Skyrim to Dragon Age. Well, that one I can understand because it's from the same studio. But for example, think about the previous game that we analyzed some months ago. Yes, I'm referring to The Lord of the Rings War in the North. That game was a hack and slash. It had no reason whatsoever to include a dialogue choice wheel at all. The dialogue lines don't influence the outcome of the game at all. Nothing at all. It feels kind of like dissociated from the rest of the gameplay mechanics, but it's there. The Lord of the Rings War in the North, as you could see, had a dialogue wheel and dialogue options. And a dialogue option system. Does it influence the rest of the story? No. DungeonSiege 3 is the same story, a bit more polished, but because you can influence that some parts of the story, but it doesn't have a significant impact. Think about something like Knights of the Old Republic or Mass Effect, and you'll quickly deduce that the dialogue lines that you choose, usually influence not only the outcome of the story, but also the very stat system of your character, because you get a bonus if you are max light side or dark side in the case of Knights of the Old Republic, so it has a huge impact. In the case of DungeonSiege 3, it receives that influence like most of the games that include the dialogue system from Mass Effect during the 7th generation, but it falls in the same category as the Lord of the Rings War in the North. It doesn't have a huge influence on the stat system of your of the gameplay mechanics at all. Zero influence, but it does have a small amount of influence in terms of the cutscenes and the outcome of the story. Small, you cannot control all of the outcomes, so it's a relatively low influence in terms of influencing the gameplay mechanics, the core gameplay mechanics of the game. So we would say that it had a below average implementation of the classic dialogue system developed by BioWare that, as I've said repeatedly, that Mass Effect influenced all of the games from the 7th generation in that aspect. Second part of the Grandeur category of the analysis, the lore. And this is something that we need to highlight. While the game was developed by Obsidian, contrary to gas-powered games that we mentioned at the beginning of the analysis during the intro, that this was a huge change. While that was the case, Obsidian was respectful and faithful, we must recognize that, and they kept Chris Taylor, the original creator of DungeonSiege 1 and 2, back when gas-powered games existed, as a creative consultant. And this is something that we've been mentioning during the 14 days of analysis of the game, of partial analysis. So this is something important, because thanks to that, Obsidian managed to create a completely cohesive environment for DungeonSiege 3. We can complain about the camera issues that we mentioned during the gameplay category. We can complain about the controls with their steep learning curve, but we cannot complain about the lore. You could see it, ladies and gentlemen, you could see it all of you could see it if you've been watching the series. The lore of this game, of this third entry of the franchise, is flawless. And when I say flawless, I mean it has over 65 entries. I think we were close to 70 lore entries. We're talking about 70 books that you can read. They are kind of like in the same vein. They are designed in the same vein as Baldur's Gate. For example, I always remember in Baldur's Gate 1, when you return to at the end of the game, when you return to the original college. It wasn't a college. It was basically a library in which you could read a lot of entries. Well, basically, we are not talking about Baldur's Gate level of lore, which is kind of like perfection, but which has dozens upon dozens of entries. But we are talking about above average lore polishing and entries. We're talking about 70, basically, as I've been mentioning. But not only that, they are pretty long, most of them. The reading is on the long side, I would say. And it's all perfectly and cohesively developed in a way that you truly feel that DungeonSiege 3 is it unfolds, it happens in the very same universe of the first two games. Why? Well, the game is able to achieve this thanks to all of the several references that it makes to the first and the second games, to both of them. It makes constant references. In fact, you can even, there's a side quest that happens in the crypt, in the tomb, or at the tomb, sorry, at the tomb of the heroes of the first game. And you can even get to the tomb of your character in the first game. There's a lot of references. There's so many references that the game, this third entry, feels so integrated, so embedded within the DungeonSiege universe that you'll feel that the game is naturally DungeonSiege 3. And this is a huge achievement. I think it's the game that most perfectly connects itself with the first and second games in a way that is amazing. Except for perfect cases like Mass Effect, which basically continues the story and everything. Except for games that directly continue the story of the previous game. This one, all things considered, considering that there's a change of hands in terms of the studio developing the third entry when compared to the first one and the second one, and the huge gap of years that between the second and the third entry, I would say that this is completely amazing, that they connected the second and the first and the second game so perfectly with the third game. In that sense, perfect, nothing to say about it. In terms of the lore of the game, it's amazing, interesting. The storyline with Jane Cassinder, it's also pretty well executed. It's cohesively developed in a way that it truly feels like a AAA developed game. If you explore all of the dialogue entries, there's a lot of side stories that are extremely interesting. You even get to know the world building is amazing with the first people and all of the section of the swamp. I don't want to get to bore you with the details, but basically the game does feature a cohesive universe and a completely polished and perfectly executed world building. Kind of like each race of the game plays a role. With for example, in Stonebridge, you have the Goblin Rebellion and the Renaissance that they integrate in society. They create a truly. There's a difference between games that simply present you characters and those like this one that actually create a cohesively designed environment in which everything feels like in real life. It in this game it feels like in real life, right? So in that sense, perfectly executed. I think it has a lot to do with the influence that Chris Taylor had as a creative consultant uh, when Obsidian developed the game. I mentioned this several times. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, I've been constantly mentioning that. I'm mentioning this once again now during the final analysis. So yes, in that sense, the storyline perfectly executed. There are some plot twists, well executed. Nothing to worry about. In that sense, going up against Jane, I would say that the game does have a bit of political influence that I don't like in terms of the main boss of the game and Queen Rosalind, kind of like the main positions of power. Um, they behave and they are specific. So yeah, you can imagine. Um, the main two figures of power, Jane and Queen Rosalind, well, uh, clearly there's a bit of political influence in the minds of the developers right there, but nothing out of the ordinary. Let's say nothing crazy about it. So well, the game has an extremely liberal mindset, and in that sense, but it does a pretty good job in respecting kind of like the other uh, side of your choices. You won't feel like, for example, in Knights of the Old Republic 1, if there's something that I always criticize, and the second one is my favorite game of all time, and the first one is right there, is that sometimes you you select options as good that are actually bad, and you cannot. It's not subtle. It's not kind of like. It's kind of like this is the mindset of the developer. This is wrong. This is right, and not objectively speaking, we are talking about something subjective about the mindset of the developer. The developer tells you this is wrong, this is right. You have to choose this because you have no other option. In Knights of the Republic 2, it's much more different. It's aware of the context of each situation. But well, in the case of DungeonSiege 3, it's I would say that the Grandeur is perfectly executed, mostly because of the lore. The lore is kind of like amazing. The lore of this game is absolutely amazing. So perfect, perfect. The lore of the game is amazing. It has original designs, everything. I love it. It perfectly, as I said, connects with the first two games. So perfect. The sound quality, as I mentioned, it has perfect 3D sound uh, and basically the soundtracks are. I wouldn't say it has any epic soundtracks that you would remember, except for the first one. The main one sticks in your head, but then the other ones don't. That's why I always increase the volume of the music in the in-game settings a bit more than the ambience sound. And yes, basically it has some good tunes, but it doesn't have any extremely memorable ones. Like, for example, think about Warcraft. We all remember uh, the main theme of StarCraft 1 or Warcraft in that sense, the game, or in Diablo 2, the main theme of the first base encampment, of the rogue encampment. So yes, in the case of this game, there's one tune that I would say you will remember, which is the main one in the menu and the Rook and Ball at the beginning of the game that is played there, but not anymore. So well, we have two flaws. I would say the soundtrack could have been better in some aspects, but overall I would say it's okay. So it's not something terrible. It just doesn't get to the perfect level of epicness. And then, as I mentioned, the dialogue system inherited from Mass Effect and Knights of the Republic, the classic BioWare dialogue system isn't fully implemented in the game. Kind of like it won't affect your stat system, for example. It won't affect your appearance, for example, in Fable 2 or in Fable 1. It does affect your appearance and everything. So yes, it could have been more fully implemented. It was only partially implemented. And now we get to the final category of the analysis. In this sense, I think we can all agree that it's the best use of the phrase your weakness, make your weakness your strength, or yes, because basically this game makes its weakness its strength, because all of the initially flawed gameplay mechanics of the game that the initial player base considered flawed gameplay mechanics are actually the strength of this game, as I mentioned at the beginning. And this is connected with this last category of the analysis. This is why I always include it, the innovation category of the analysis. How much the game contributed to redefining the gameplay mechanics of the genre it belongs to. Well, in that sense, I think we can all agree that while you can criticize the game for having unconventional controls, as I've said, I don't consider them flawed. I objectively and metaphysically proved you why at the beginning of the analysis why they aren't flawed, but they just have a steeper learning curve due to the fact that you cannot inherit your previous knowledge from playing other isometric action RPG games. While I don't think they are, since I don't think they are flawed, its weakness is its strength. All of the controls, all of the stat system, everything in this game is new. It's new. It's completely different. It redefines the very stat system of the isometric action RPG genre. It redefines, but not in a moderate way, kind of like in an almost complete way. In terms of the gameplay mechanics, I always make this distinction when I get to this part of the analysis. If the game has an inherent stat system, an intrinsic or an extrinsic stat system, according to if the base attack, if the base stats of the game are increased by looting gear or by spending stat points. And in this game, in the case of this game, we can say that this game is a complete. Think about, for example, Destiny, Borderlands, Monster Hunter, though I hate the gameplay mechanics of Monster Hunter. All of those are extrinsic. You cannot increase your base stats by a lot. In the case of Borderlands, the first one, you actually can, because it uses the proficiency system rather than the badass system of the second one, if I remember correctly, which is much more moderate, and you can even deactivate it 100%. Think about Knights of the Republic. You don't get a lot of stats increase from the skill tree at all. It's mostly from the gear. Think about all of those games, and then think about games that basically you can only increase your stats by spending skill points. Imagine something like I don't know, Skyrim is a perfect example of this. You can increase all of your stats indefinitely. It has a huge level cap, etc. Generally, we have a hybrid system in modern RPG games in which you increase your base stats through spending stat points and also through your gear. Generally, it's hybrid. However, in the case of DungeonSiege 3, we are talking about a pretty weird case, like in all of the categories that that I've been analyzing about this game. This game is weird in a true sense of the in the true sense of the word. Um, this game uses an inherent, a completely extrinsic stat system. You cannot increase your base stats whatsoever. It's a perfect example of a pure extrinsic system, like Monster Hunter. You cannot increase your base stats through nothing at all. It's not hybrid, nothing. It's not nothing at all. Nothing at all. For example, when we were analyzing Hellgate London, I mentioned that you could increase your base accuracy when you're playing as that one uses a system which is hybrid, for some classes, and then purely extrinsic for the marksman that I played, for example, because you cannot increase your base stat damage, but the swordsman can. Pretty weird as well. But in the case of DungeonSiege, it's a purely extrinsic system. You cannot increase your base stats through spending points in a skill tree whatsoever. Think about World of Warcraft. You can increase your base will, your base attack damage, your base ability damage through spending points on your skill. In your skill tree here, on your skill tree here you cannot. You can only increase your base stats through your gear. 100%. A pure extrinsic game like Monster Hunter. A pure extrinsic RPG like Monster Hunter. So yeah, only through your gear you can increase your base attack damage or your base ability damage. So yes, basically it's a purely extrinsic classification. As for the rest, in terms of the innovation, all of the stat system has a completely different naming convention. It has a completely different everything, 100%. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, we can say that the game, if there's one thing this game does right, is the lore, as I've said in the Grandeur category, but also the innovation. It's completely different than when compared to other isometric action RPG games, and as I've said, your previous experience that you got from playing other isometric action RPG games won't help you with this game. You simply cannot inherit it, and that's the definitive proof that they made a huge effort, and it was successful because the gameplay loop is properly designed. They made a huge effort. The talented developers over at Obsidian, they made a huge effort to make this game completely different when compared to Diablo 3. They tried to make something completely different, and I think that should be taken into account when analyzing a game, and I think that should be taken into account when we classify games, and I think it's something that we should all look up to and we should all admire, that they took the time to completely change everything. So that's why I'm not gonna mod the stats of the game anytime. I love the fact that they changed the naming convention. I don't agree with having the same naming convention for the stats here. They created kind of like different added effects, like wording, like a lot of crazy effects that, like leeching, not only like distinguishing between, making a difference between leeching through basic attacks and ability damage. Incredible. They put a lot of effort into creating new effects, new stats, new everything, new naming conventions. So yes, I don't like naming conventions. I think there's no reason for you to call your mana bar. You should call it in a different way if you want to try to kind of like make a different game than all of the previous ones that have been ever developed throughout history. So yes, just as a stupid example, and the fact that they used two resources instead of one, with the focus bar and the purple orbs used for different abilities, I think all of that contributes to making this game a completely new experience that I think everyone should experience. Because of all of the things that I mentioned, now is the moment. Let's get to the final qualification for DungeonSiege 3. Well, considering all of the flaws that I mentioned for each of the categories, they are mostly minor, except for the camera, the one that I mentioned, and yeah, the enemy recycling and the overall length. There's also not a lot of replayability, kind of like if had they added replayability, a bit of replayability, the game would have been much better. The enemies respawn in a lot of sections, but they are respawning just so you can actually farm. They don't respawn to kind of like feed an end game cycle of that you can play like in Diablo 3. I think that's another huge flaw. And yes, basically those are the biggest flaws that I've encountered throughout these 14 days of gameplay. So, people, let's get to the final qualification for DungeonSiege 3. My final qualification for it would be an exact from F to A. I would qualify it with a B plus. With a B plus. Now, I was quite harsh with Hellgate London, the base game, not modded. Modded is a 10 out of 10. And in the case of this game, if we're comparing the base game of that one, but many more others that I've seen, I mean, if Titan Quest is a 10 out of 10, if Diablo 2 is a 10 out of 10, if Torchlight 2 is a 10 out of 10, the base games without any mods, with mods they are kind of like perfect. If Borderlands is a 10 out of 10, if Knights of the Republic is a 10 out of 10, this one is a B plus. It's not 10 out of 10. It's in terms of a numeric. I always use both qualifications, both marks. If I have to use a numeric mark using numbers, I would say the game is an 8.5, pretty similar to base Hellgate London without modding. This one with the DLC, with everything, with all of the side quests, is kind of like pretty much at the same spot. I think I awarded Hellgate London a bit lower, kind of like 8.1, 8.2. This one definitely feels like a more polished product, just so you have a direct comparison with the previous analysis that I did. In the case of War in the North, I think I awarded it even less. I think I awarded it an 8, also a bit below 7.5. This one, the gameplay loop is properly executed. Everything is perfectly executed. 8.3, I would say. 8.4, 8.35.4 would be. It doesn't get to 8.5. Because of all of the things that I mentioned. It should have been longer, but it's still longer than average, so I need to take that into account. So the gameplay loop is correctly executed. As I've said, because of all of the things that I've explained, the controls aren't flawed, so your final qualification, 8.35. If you want something extremely exact, B plus or B, yeah, pretty much. So yes, from 0 to 10, 8.4, something like that. I awarded War in the North 7.8, 7.5. It doesn't get to 8, and I awarded Hellgate London, base Hellgate London, 8.1, 8.2, if I remember correctly. But if I don't, those are mostly the qualifications in my head, just so you have some RPGs as a reference. This one is a bit above average, all things considered. All things considered. The graphical presentation is better than in all of the previous games that I mentioned. The lore is extremely polished, the gameplay loop is correctly executed, and the innovation, mostly the innovation is incredible. They redesigned a stat system, some definitions of the stat system that we've seen in isometric action RPG games for years. Is that positive? Is that negative? Does it confuse the player? Yes, it will confuse the player, but we have to be honest and grant and concede to them that they put the time and effort to create a new stat system that we haven't seen in most isometric action RPG games. And with all of that said, at exactly 2 hours and a half, we finish the final qualification. DungeonSiege 3 ends up with a qualification of 8.35, B plus, or a B, if you have a B, if you have to mention, if we have to be precise. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you from the bottom of my heart. A lot of people have subscribed to the YouTube channel in the time that I've been playing this game. I remember that I started this game with with 20 something. I ended up with, and we are now at 33. So thanks from the bottom of my heart to each one of the subscribers of the YouTube channel. If you're watching this as a YouTube ball, thank you for watching my analysis. Thank you for appreciating all of the work, time, and effort I put into them. You know that my analysis are not scripted, so it takes even more effort because I have to remember as I review the games. But I think it is extremely positive and helpful because there's kind of like a direct relationship between what I'm saying and what I'm thinking about, rather than having it have a scripted kind of like robotic analysis, a robotic review. And I know you'll appreciate that from me, so thanks from the bottom of my heart. A special thanks, of course, to all of the followers of the Twitch channel, especially from the bottom of my heart, that whenever you join me, it's extremely special for me and it's amazing, and I love it when you all visit me, even if it's at different times, when you all visit me to remember all of these forgotten gems that certainly deserved more praise. The main focus of this game was that the controls, as I've said, they were considered flawed, and they are not flawed. They have a steeper learning curve, which simply involves the fact that you cannot inherit your prior experience, your previous experience from playing other isometric action RPG games. But we need to be honest, that's part of the innovation category of my analysis, and something that we all should take into account when reviewing games. Because imagine if there would be no new gameplay mechanics. Imagine if the developers don't experiment with new gameplay mechanics, we would be stuck with turn-based games. Real-time games would never exist. 3D games would never exist. We would all have 2D platformers. So in that sense, that's the main argument that I have to defend this game, because truly, honestly, it makes a huge effort to be unique at the end of the day, and that's what is important. And I know that my ancient and legendary analysis are unique. That's why I thank you to all of you who may have taken the time in general. Special thanks, of course, to all of the followers of the Twitch channel and all of the subscribers of the YouTube channel. Special thanks to all of you, but also thanks to anyone who might have taken the time to watch this as a YouTube VOD or a Twitch VOD, or watch my analysis in general and the content, the niche content we do here. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to all of you from the bottom of my heart. With all of that said, we are done with the analysis. This was the final analysis of DungeonSiege 3, people. So, see you all in the next one. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you all in the next one. We need to choose the next game for analysis. Maybe I won't return on Thursday, but rather next week, because I need to pick the next game that we have to analyze. I also have a pretty short game that I wanted to showcase that I couldn't showcase last time, but we'll see about that. So, ladies and gentlemen, guys, people, everyone, gamers of all ages, see you all, thank you, and see you all in the next analysis. This was, after 14 days of gameplay, my final review of DungeonSiege 3. I highly recommend you try it out without looking at Metacritic, without looking at the rest of the websites that award this a 7. This game, with all of the side quests and everything, I would say it's much more, it's closer to 8.5. I would say it's, as I've said, 8.35, 8.30. So yes, highly recommended. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been my pleasure. See you all in the next analysis, the next review of all of these forgotten gems that we analyze. Be sure to stay tuned because we have plenty of other surprises, many more forgotten gems that we need to analyze. I have an idea of what I'm gonna choose, but well, we'll see. We'll see. I have different genres. As you could see in the integral history of PC game genres, I have different genres. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. See you all in the next